So, I mean, I think the basic level of instability is, the reality is none of this really matters if you don't have a trigger event. So if Pakistan continues a revisionist strategy against India, right, and that's morphed over the years. Originally, Pakistan, its strategy was kind of to mess around in Jammu and Kashmir and Punjab by funding militancy within India. Then you had the Pakistanification of the J&K militancy in the early 90s. And then you had the Kargil War, which is kind of a similar strategy. But the evolution since 1998 is that Pakistan has been, I think, a little more emboldened about sponsoring massive terrorist attacks on Indian cities. And I think that is kind of the question that both India and Pakistan face, which is, India so far has not reacted to that. Even if it wanted to after 2001, it didn't. In 2008, there was no conventional mobilization. And all of this only gets going if there's a trigger event. I think India has no interest in, crossing the international border or destroying Pakistan or, cutting it in 4 pieces or whatever the Pakistani fears may be. And its interest, I think both sides agree that the line of control eventually could be codified as the international border, and you could get an agreement between them. And for India's part, its primary interest is economic growth. It would love to be left alone by Pakistan. As long as Pakistan doesn't export militancy to Indian cities, then you have strategic stability between them. Pakistan's question is, what is its interest and incentive to continue to sponsor potentially subconventional attacks against India? Is it, to try to reduce or slow down India's economic growth, because that hasn't really worked? Is it to keep the periodic threat of India alive so that the army can continue to, hold a privileged state in society? Maybe. And a lot of these questions, I think, are for Pakistan to figure out. And then, but absent a trigger event, I think there's general stability between India and Pakistan. India has no incentive to get in a war with Pakistan, and Pakistan doesn't have the ability, I think, to really adjust the territorial boundaries between the two. And so you have high-level strategic stability between them otherwise. So if Pakistan is willing to abandon subconventional attacks against India, or conventional attacks across, the line of control, vice versa, both ways, then I actually think you have high-level stability between them. But short of that, then once you have a trigger event, all of this comes into play, and then you might have high levels of strategic instability, especially as India tries to search for an answer to try to deter these attacks going forward.
One of the main challenges, I think, is the evolving nature of strategic stability itself in South Asia. Unlike Cold War bilateral competition, South Asia has additional power at play in this competition that actually make the situation more complex and multipolar. This shift has changed Cold War security dilemma into what George Colbert calls a security trilemma, where more than 2 parties are involved. In South Asia's case, it's China, India, and Pakistan. Looking at the challenges at the bilateral level between India and Pakistan, I think there are multiple challenges as the situation evolves. For instance, between India and Pakistan, one may look at doctrinal challenges as the bigger one, where it not only creates ambiguity, it also creates a certain incongruity between the policies of 2 states. And then lack of escalation control mechanisms on the part of India and Pakistan actually make the situation complex and add challenges to the strategic stability. Then growing conventional asymmetry, where India's conventional power is increasing exponentially and Pakistan is lagging behind. Hence, it leads to more reliance on nuclear weapons that adds problems in terms of adding more challenges to strategic stability. Then there are strategic defense upgrades. For instance, there are missile developments, there is introduction of a strategic missile defense program, and then there are a number of disruptive technologies that are being introduced. Besides that, then regional rebalancing is very important, where India's shift, America's major shift towards India, and China is more including its, China is going more towards Pakistan. That regional balancing is actually creating more problems at the regional level. And last but not the least, I think it's the strategic culture of both countries, which is adding more troubles to the overall strategic environment, and that adds more challenges to the strategic stability.
First, there is a concern about nuclear balances. India has less of a concern about balances because nuclear weapons don't represent the sword point of its diplomacy. They are there, but they are assessed. But at the Pakistani end, there is a grave concern about nuclear balances. And there is a perpetual fear that India has a much bigger arsenal than it owns up to. And that creates incentives in Pakistan for a continuous modernization and expansion of its own arsenal. So one source of instability is essentially fears about nuclear balances and what the real balance is. But there's a second source of instability, and that is nuclear weapons make subconventional conflict possible. Now, this is an idea that goes back to the early days of the Cold War. And Glenn Snyder had first identified the paradox, which he called the stability-instability paradox, which is under circumstances where states have competing political goals and competition continues unmitigated, the presence of nuclear weapons prevents those states from achieving their political goals through direct conflict. So it pushes down the sources of conflict to the subconventional level, where deniability allows states to continue acts of state-sponsored violence without having to pay the cost in terms of, in the nuclear realm, without having to pay the cost in the nuclear realm. And so I think that is the instability that we see today in South Asia, where Pakistan in particular finds it easy to conduct a variety of subconventional conflicts under the nuclear umbrella. And India finds itself almost, finds itself hard to respond because conventional responses bring in their wake the threats of escalation.
In the recent years, few sources of instability that have emerged are broadly there are threefold. First is India's stated goal to acquire and field a ballistic missile defense system. That degrades Pakistan's confidence in its ability to successfully defend itself if the time comes, and gives India the confidence that it can resort to a preemptive strike. Secondly is the acquisition of sea-based deterrence capabilities by both sides. Largely it is the result of a technological advancements that both countries are acquiring, but Pakistan is facing a resource constraint. Given Pakistan's economic conditions, financial woes, Pakistan cannot acquire or is unable to acquire an SSBN to field a classical sense of short second strike capability. If Pakistan is unable to do that, how will the sea-based deterrence play out over the period of next decade? It remains to be seen, and it will inherently have be unstable in the sense that Pakistan will be less confident of that. Thirdly is the first strike instability. Pakistan had stated that it refuses to give an LFU, and because of the conventional asymmetry, it always says that it will be if as a last resort, it will be the first one it will not hesitate to use the nuclear weapons first. But in recent years, India has shown a seriousness towards a preemptive strike. If India goes first, that introduces a high-risk strategy and a first strike instability that undermines Pakistan. And lastly, largely, is the India-US strategic cooperation that has been going on. Over the next decade or so, as the strategic cooperation deepens, Pakistan will be at a disadvantage. India's strategic capabilities will be augmented and strengthened. While Pakistan is facing its own resource constraint, it won't be able to match with India's, and that balance that is there right now in some ways will be much more disturbed.
I find in the case of Pakistan and India, the pressures are mostly from crisis stability. Given that Pakistan's nuclear strategy is essentially built on the concept of a managed instability, they believe that in that kind of a situation, they derive better deterrence. But the chances of escalation in case the crisis gets out of hand is something that puts a lot of pressure on deterrent stability. The idea of tactical nuclear weapons, the concept that Pakistan would be putting its nuclear-tipped missiles on surface ships, which are essentially not survivable vessels, even if they're looking for survivability, and therefore inadvertent risks that come with these kinds of deployments is where I find the greatest amount of deterrence instability between India and Pakistan.
I think these are two countries which have a history of fighting with each other actively, and they have unresolved disputes. That was not the case in Cold War. The US and Soviet soldiers had only met once on the battlefield, and that was once they were celebrating victory in Berlin. So they never fought with each other directly, and there was also the geography was such that there was a huge difference, geographical space between the two countries. India, Pakistan have a contiguous geography, and they have a history of, as I said, war and unresolved disputes. That is one, and the other is that the cardinal point of nuclearization, which is that it tends to freeze the status quo. That fact has not been really accepted by either country. And because of that, there have been continuous challenges to deterrence credibility. India has been talking since February 2000 of the space for a limited conventional war below the nuclear threshold. Particularly since the current government in India, they came into power, so they wanted to have a more aggressive posture and policy towards Pakistan. So they have upped the ante across the line of control and across the working boundaries. So there's a continuous physical challenge in the form of firing of small arms and mortars and artillery guns across the line of control and working boundary, which causes casualties, both civilian and military. So that's a continuous challenge. The second is the doctrinal level that I already mentioned through the cold start. So these are basically challenges which do not let the nuclear stability or strategic stability settle down and firm up in South Asia.